Good afternoon now. How
It
you
is.
doing?
Great, thanks.
So you're here before it gets real cold,
I am.
from California.
Yes.
And you're now a professor at California,
I'm at University of California, Irvine.
Irvine,
Yes.
Irvine, absolutely. So your book, I was really thrilled with it because I started reading it, didn't finish, but what I was so surprised at was things I didn't know that I thought I did. I didn't know that so many people were working here. At one point, it was like 80,000.
That's right.
80,000.
At its peak, GM's payroll in the county, in Genesee County, was over 80,000. That was in the 1950s.
In the 1950s.
Mhm.
What year did GM leave? Or was it a gradual attrition?
It happened over time. It happened over time. The out-migration of GM plants from the city really began to happen during the 1940s. And between 1940 and 1960, GM built 8 new industrial complexes in Genesee County, but all of them were in the suburbs outside of Flint. And one of the interesting things about Flint's story is that at that point in time, when GM built those plants outside of the city, they were still looking to return them to the city through annexation or a regional government. They were ultimately unable to implement that plan, but that was initially what GM executives had hoped to do, is build plants in the suburbs and then return them to the city.
And what happened?
Well, they were unsuccessful in the plan to build the so-called New Flint.
Was this the city's fault, or was it their fault, or they had projected wrong, or?
Well, this was, I mean, if you want to blame this on anybody, it was white suburbanites who resisted this plan. In 1958, GM leaders and city officials proposed a so-called New Flint to enlarge the city's boundaries and return those plants back to the city. And when they did that, white suburbanites rose up in opposition. They didn't want to share those resources with the city. They wanted to keep them, so they would keep funding their schools and communities. And so they resisted that plan. It was ultimately defeated in the Supreme Court of Michigan.
Oh, Supreme Court.
State Supreme Court.
Okay.
But that kind of took regionalism off the table for quite some time in this area. And so Flint and its suburbs really developed in isolation rather than together.
Right, because there was a migration of black people from the South, correct?
Yes.
And they were able to earn a middle-class wage also. And do you believe the suburbanites the people who, they probably once lived in Flint who became suburbanites,
Mm-hmm.
and they were resistant to this everybody living together as one, or what?
I think that's part of the story. You're right that Flint offered decent wages for workers, white and black, although part of Flint's story is a divergence between the opportunity structure for white people and African Americans. So even at GM, it was virtually impossible for black workers to get apprenticeships until well into the 1960s and beyond. And so disproportionately, black workers were working in lower paying service positions, like as janitors or as paint chippers or those sorts of positions that were lower paying. Over time, those disparities were reduced, but those were an important part of the story that I wrote about in the book.
What was the year that GM was just gone, all gone?
Well, it still isn't all gone. So over time, the shift of those plants to the suburbs was the first part of the story.
Yes.
And then the city's inability to get them back was the second part.
Second.
The third part of the story is a very devastating wave of plant closures in the 80s and 90s. That's central, and even dipping back into the 70s, of plant closures and layoffs as GM attempted to restructure. And that's when you might think of the deindustrialization really taking shape.
Because I'm trying to think about, you're talking about the late 70s. Was that when the gasoline crisis started happening and they started
Yes.
laying off at the plant? They weren't selling as many cars, or what?
That's part of the story.
Or
It was
the K
the
car.
twin energy crises of the 1970s, the economic recessions of that period. Those economic difficulties produced really catastrophic conditions in places like Flint. And so layoffs and plant closures are happening really from then through the close of the last century. Probably the biggest blow came in the 1990s when GM shut down Buick City, once Flint's largest employer.
Right.
But the interesting part of Flint's story is that GM never fully left. They still have operations here in the city. They're not anywhere near what they used to be, but they're still making things in Flint.
I guess Michael Moore led a lot of people to believe everything was completely gone.
I think so. Michael Moore, hyperbole is kind of his MO.
Absolutely.
And the truth is that the city is we've dropped from a high of around 80,000 in the 1950s down to well under 10,000. I think it's even under 5,000 now, GM employees. And so the workforce has really been decimated.
Well, what has
No doubt
been
about
the
it.
response to your book?
It's been great so far.
Demolition Means Progress.
That's right. Demolition
Yes.
Means Progress.
And why did you use that title?
So I developed the title based upon signs that GM used to put in front of its shuttered plants in Flint. When they closed down a plant, they would put up a sign that said, Demolition Means Progress. The demolition company doing the demo would do that. And when I first saw those signs all over town, I wondered, is this just a trite and somewhat offensive corporate slogan? Because we're talking about people's jobs.
Satire.
And, right. But then over time I realized that it was much more than that. It was really a metaphor for this process of reinvention and redevelopment that's played such an important part of Flint's history. And what I mean by that is that really the driving force in my book is this constant quest to tear down what leaders here believe to be outdated and inefficient structures and institutions and remake them to be more profitable. And so when GM wanted to stimulate growth, they would tear down old urban plants and rebuild them in the suburbs. When the city experienced economic crisis, they wanted to tear down poor neighborhoods and build a new freeway in place of them. And at every stage, these renewal attempts only hardened social inequalities in the region. They hardened lines of racial inequality,
Yes.
hardened economic inequalities, and they created a very fragmented political landscape where the city is so divided from the suburbs. And so didn't bring progress, brought more misery to a lot of people in the end.
So, with what you see that's happening in Flint right now, do you see or envision some hope for betterment?
That's a difficult question. I think that I'm always hopeful. I'm a hopeful person, and I'm always hopeful about Flint in particular because Flint has experienced more heartache and difficulty than most other places that you can think of. It's experienced harsh deindustrialization and depopulation. It's experienced violence, way off the charts compared to other places. It's experienced difficulties that have hardened, I think, the people of Flint and steeled them for meeting the challenges that come ahead.
And there's still some polarization, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, Flint remains one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the country. But there's no doubt that the years to come are going to be difficult. At this point, many months down the line, only a small fraction of the water lines have been replaced. And so fresh drinking water is going to continue to be a major issue for residents, not only drinking water, but bathing water and cooking water. And so that's probably the central challenge. But we also have challenges in local public schools, challenges with neighborhood economic development. And so, the things will not come easily for this city and its people. As I said, if I've learned anything in writing this book, it's that people don't give up on their town easily.
Right.
And that's absolutely the case with the people of Flint.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think all of our hearts go out to Flint.
Yeah.
And we appreciate you writing the book because as I've been reading, your research has been phenomenal, and you did talk to people, a lot of people, right?
I did. I talked to people, I read a lot of oral interviews,
Right.
and I spent a long time in archives and libraries
Yes.
trying to piece together the story.
Yes.
I appreciate you saying that to me. Thank
Well,
you.
I really, well, I love research because you can learn so much. And I'd like to thank you for coming and being our keynote speaker today.
Thank
and
you.
I just wish you the best. Hopefully you could come back to Flint from time to time.
I'd love to.
And we're hoping for progress.
Well, me too. And Flint has given me so much that I'm happy to give back whenever I can. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.